do send it back to the parties to try to get a resolution, because that's still the best result for everyone. Fees are low at that point. We then check jurisdictional issues. So is it outside the 6-year rule? Does it relate to, we do have a discretion to not take on disputes about wholesale clients. I'll talk a bit more about that later. And then after all that, it goes, sorry, monetary caps, of course, as well. So, we can take $1 million claims and award up to $500,000 per claim. Case management goes through, and I acknowledge that that's sort of county court type of, money. And we're very conscious of that. That was one of the big factors in putting together AFCA and determining the monetary limit. We then go to case management. So we've got a team, and they try to resolve it mainly by sort of soft skills, negotiation, conciliation, preliminary assessment. And then we go to a final decision. Only 10% of our disputes actually go to final decision. 90% are resolved earlier. And we incentivise really parties to resolve disputes earlier. What you expect from us is we have an independent review of issues and merits of the complaint, experienced complaint resolution staff with industry knowledge. We do have a broad mix of staff. We have advisors. We have, people who come from, say, a consumer background, and we have people who come from, outside the industry, who are expert in dispute resolution, for example. But through the team approach, we feel that we can give some useful thoughts about how to resolve your dispute. We do try to contact the parties regularly by telephone, and we do try to deal with things efficiently. So that means we don't make generic information requests. We do tend to just try to target the information that we're asking of parties. So the last 12 months of operations, up to 31 March, that's what it looks like. Now, I made this comment at the SMSF conference that I saw Sam at, that, investment disputes are a very small number. So out of 75,000, I know the date, that's March and May, but essentially 75,000 complaints, 2% are investment disputes. So that's what, about 1,500 odd out of the vast majority. The big ones remain credit, remain loans, remain general insurance, and banking related disputes. Superannuation makes up a big part. So investments, numerically, is not a huge number overall. These are the challenges that we've faced as an organisation. We've had a lot more complaints than expected. Largely, the Royal Commission has put a highlight on things so people are more aware of their rights. We actively promote AFCA, and that's because we did some research with ASIC, which showed that there was a very, very low understanding of AFCA and what we do. We've grown from 340 to over 800. And we're also clearing some of our predecessors' complaints. Now, just to give you an understanding of the type of disputes we get. So I know this doesn't match up with the other figure I provided you, but relatively recently, we've actually had a bit of a look at insolvent companies. A lot of our disputes, the company goes insolvent, we're dealing with them. We've decided at the moment not to deal with those, which is explained why the INA numbers are now sort of 1,700. Up to October, they were 3,900, but that included a lot of the insolvent companies. But essentially, this gives you a feel of things, and most advisors are pleasantly surprised when they see this. So the top 5 products, foreign exchange is number 1, 1,100. Mixed asset funds, so managed funds, are 423. Self-managed super is 367. So if you think 367 out of 39, 10% of those, and if you think 36 of 70,000 disputes we receive. So it's not many in the scheme of things. Superannuation funds and shares, not surprisingly, industry types, financial advisors are the highest. Foreign exchange dealers are big, and that's, it's largely because Australia creates a environment that encourages these sort of companies to operate. derivatives, make and market, all those ones in the middle, and banks are 345. This just really quickly shows you complaints received. So we got 315, for example, in October. You'll see it deviates up between sort of 270 and 440. But we then accept 225 of those 300. So that means a lot are out jurisdictionally, based on timeframes, based on monetary amounts. Sometimes that also, they're ones that have been resolved. So you get an opportunity to resolve those when they're first lodged. So the 225 for a month, just to give you a feel for that. That's the status we close at. As I said to you, most done before decision. We only get a very small number that goes to decision. And to be honest, I hope that it even gets smaller, because once it gets to a decision and me making a final call, that's not what we want. We find that the greatest satisfaction in customer disputes are being resolved by negotiation agreement, conciliation ideally. There's some further sort of granular detail about it. The only thing I'll just point out to you here is, so out of the decisions, 6% are in favour of the complainant, 4% are in favour of the financial firm. So, the fact, the criticism AFCA's consumer focused, well, I mean, the final decisions don't actually align with that sort of criticism. Top 5 issues: failure to follow instructions, inappropriate advice, best interest. Obviously, best interest, we're still dealing with inappropriate advice, as in pre-1 July 13 breaches. And as you would have known, we do, the government extended us to deal with legacy disputes from 1 July 2008. So that took us back further. That window to lodge those is almost ending shortly. But yeah, failure to follow instructions, there's 1,031 of those. That literally is FX providers, CFD providers not processing withdrawals, in simple terms. Or alternatively, advisors, believe it or not, running off with people's money. That's what that means. So I do this to show, because I think there's a lot of sort of mystery about what we deal with. And in a lot of ways, it should give you all a lot of confidence, because, we see the worst of the worst, really. I mean, the ticky touchwood disputes, there aren't a lot of them. I'll go into some scenarios later and explain it, but I did a recent breakfast at the FPA, and most of them were horrified at the things that advisors did and we found against them. Having said that, I mean, we do get some which are 50-50, and in those cases we get a panel. So we get an experienced industry rep and experienced consumer rep involved. So trends, very broadly, I know most of you I would understand work, and just nod if this is correct, Sam, at work, because I can see you. I can't see anyone else, but I can see you work in the SMSF space, so interested in that. So thank you. So that's, inappropriate advice to establish an SMSF is the common one. We talk about 500 grand productivity commission, 250 grand ASIC, all the debates around amounts to make a SMSF viable. Can I just ask a question on that? Obviously, ASIC had a view and published that as to the levels that they thought were appropriate for an individual or a couple to have to establish an SMSF. What's AFCA's view, or are you able to have a view as to what's appropriate? Look, we do take the view that about 250,000, it's not really that cost effective under that balance. Arguably up to 500. Now, we don't go and publish that because every case is dependent on its facts. And I want to make that clear because, you can have an SMSF at 200 grand that is suitable for someone. And, the reason are that they want to spend the time, looking at their investments. They want to take an interest in it. They want more control, all those things. So, we do take the view that, if you're sort of 250 or less, it's problematic, but nothing's black and white. So failure to provide ongoing advice, 2 SMSFs, is another one. Inappropriate scoping is a very big one. And what we're talking about there is when the advisor essentially says, my role is merely to set up the SMSF. The property company pick the property for you, and it's normally in a related group situation. Inappropriate scoping. So, you know, we are pretty firm on that, you have to, it's pretty hard to just say that your role in that is merely to set up the SMSF. If someone comes to see you about a property and is interested in SMSF, I would argue normally the scope of that advice would be to discuss with them the pros and cons, not only of the SMSF, but what they're invested in. So investment properties continue to be a big one. Gladstone's a big one. Mining towns, off the plan properties tends to be a big one. We had one recently where the guy said that he was out the front mowing his lawn and someone door knocked him, offered him an iPad if he turned up to a meeting with an accountant, advisor and property sort of you know, mortgage broker. But within the day, he got his iPad, but he also got an SOA and had signed up to enter an SMSF and buy an off-the-plan property. So problematic stuff, and I think, you know, most people would agree. I assume who are listening. Conflicted advice continues to be a big one. I'll make a few comments about that, about JVs, about you know. If you know, you've got some sort of relationship with a related accounting firm, and give you some thoughts on that. Obviously with the rider, that everything is dependent on the facts itself. Okay, so I'll get into the case studies. I'm conscious we sort of said 40 minutes, so I've gone 20 on general. I'll do 20 on the case studies, and then there'll be time for questions as Sam highlighted. So, just broadly speaking, you know, with all the obligations and regulations on advisors, on, you know, the Tax Agents Act and the professional indemnity and ASIC and all sorts of stuff, I think sometimes it's worth just simplifying things. And this to me is always a good slide. Prior to 1 July 13, know your product, know your client, provide appropriate advice. 1 July 13 to 1 January 20, it adds the best interest obligation. And after 1 January 2020, you've got the Code of Ethics. And that in simple terms explains the different phases. Now, we apply the standards at the relevant time. So if the complaint's about advice from 1 July 2012, assuming it's within jurisdiction, we don't apply best interests. We apply appropriateness as it was implemented at that time. Now, you get lots of arguments about that because people say, well, how could you not be affected? And sure, you know, we understand what's happened afterwards, but to the best we can, we apply that standard. So obviously Code of Ethics won't apply to 1 January 2020 disputes. So just the first one is just a really brief retail wholesale one. So John came to us and says a financial firm gave him misleading information about IPOs, and he was seeking compensation of 1.7 million over all the IPOs. He did have a qualified accountant certificate that said he held assets of 2.5 million. That was him individually. So he signed this document. It's not the whole thing, but the end of it says, you know, we understand that the purpose of being classified as sophisticated, the legal entities, because he was investing through a vehicle, not individually, will be eligible to invest in boutique, sophisticated investment offerings that arise from time to time. These offerings are not made pursuant to disclosure documents, and you as a sophisticated investor must make your own assessment on the merits. Sophisticated investors are exempt from normal disclosure requirements necessary to the provision of financial services. Now, I don't know if we can sort of take comments, but I wondered, is there any views that this is the end of it? He signed the certificate, and that should be all we look at. Can we do that, Sam, or maybe?
Yeah, I think, Anthony, have you got is anything coming through on the Q&A there, or do you want to expand it further? I think you're just on mute at the moment.
I've got one question that relates to an earlier slide regarding SMSFs and property spruikers, but if anyone's got a particular comment, I'm just trying to work out how to, if anyone's got a comment, they can pop it through on the questions, and then in relation to these things, or if there's a raise hand, I'm trying to work out the raise hand function to allow people to put their hand up, and then I can allow them to speak.
Yeah. Well, we'll continue on from there, Shail. Obviously,
someone's saying use the chat app.
Yeah, I've seen that. So I mean, I'm happy for anyone to use chat questions or raise their hand, and then I can allow them to speak as well. So if anyone wants to ask or comment on this in particular, just send me a note and I'll allow you to.
Well, I think one of the bits you'll comment on, Shail, obviously it's not the end of the scenario for this client, just signing a certificate saying, yeah, that's fine. I mean, obviously it's got to be appropriate advice, and whether he is retail or wholesale, depending on which entity, or whether they're the trustee of the super fund or the individual. So I'm sure you'll cover off on that. But one of the questions we have, or comes up from time to time, is where you've got clients with, say, significant wealth inside and outside of their self-managed super funds, and qualify under retail advice if you're advising the super fund in terms of contributions and what they're doing. But where wholesale then kicks in, if it's just purely investment advice during the year about buying or selling shares, so they're potentially wholesale for that advice component around the investment piece, but retail around the SMSF, FCMSF piece, and whether you've got some thoughts there about just how it can get a bit murky between wholesale and retail, and you get caught out.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. I mean, that's a really good question. Essentially, what we say is that is entirely possible that might happen. That there might be a time when you're dealing with a client in a retail capacity and the retailer protections apply, but there might be a time when they're interested in wholesale investments. So first thing I'd say is you are allowed to do it, okay? The second thing I'd say is that, to me, what it boils down to is informed consent. So just that they understand firstly, what the difference is between you treating them as a retail client and a wholesale client. And secondly, that they understand for any individual piece of advice, what capacity you're acting in. The disputes we've had around that tend to be where the financial firm has not been clear that for this purpose, you're being treated as wholesale, but for this purpose, you're being treated as retail. And the client is legitimately under the view that they were being treated as retail, for example, they were recommended something, when in fact, it was more a wholesale offering that was up to them to choose. So we'll keep going, and just if anyone does want to chat, I do tend to like a bit of discussion as we go. So this is all a bit weird for me, just hearing my own voice going on. That's right.
Have we got any questions there?
I've got two questions. So what I might do is just allow Rob Pine to talk, and he can ask his question, and then I've got another question from Peter Mansell. So if you're happy to take the questions as they roll in. Yeah. They might not be related to the slide you're on, but at least we get them answered as we go along. So Rob, I'll hand to you for the moment. Rob?
Hi, Shail, can you hear me?
Yeah, hi Rob, how you going?
Good, thanks. Thanks for the session. It's good. I like where we're going with this, and thanks for the boys at Warhunt getting it organised. So this question that I wanted to pose to you is those off the plan property spruikers. We've all seen plenty of them, unfortunately. Can you give us some examples of the settlements that you've seen in favour of the end client? What kind of compensation have they been able to receive in those circumstances?
Sure. Good question, Rob. Basically, what we do, it's all dependent on each fact situation. But just say someone's in an industry fund, and believe it or not, this is often how it happens. They're in industry funds. They either respond to an ad about property investment, and let's just say they do that. They respond to the ad. Then sometimes that name is provided to an advisor, and an advisor will contact them. Now, in that sort of situation, just say they're on a very low balance and they get a limited recourse borrowing arrangement, and we find it's not suitable. the compensation would be calculated by if we form this view that they would have remained in the fund they were in, but for the breach. Essentially, the compensation would be to look at their actual loss. So say the property's gone from 500 to 200, they lose 300 there, but compare that to where they would have been had they not invested in the property. So you know, you might take the 250 and apply a balanced return on it, you know, 5% or whatever else it is over 5 years, and compare the actual with the but for position. So they end up essentially getting back their actual losses, but also the losses that they've suffered by not being in their not being in their industry fund. So big amounts, in short, big amounts.
Yeah, right. That's really interesting because we've seen too many of those situations, and really the client feels a bit helpless about the fact they've made a bad choice. But in fact, the circumstances often are as you describe. So that's really helpful. Thanks, Shail.
Yeah, no worries at all. Any others, Anthony, at the moment? I'll just keep.
Yeah, I've got Peter Mansell. Peter, if you're happy to ask your question.
Hi, Shail. Like Rob said, I'm extremely impressed by what you've done so far. And again, thanks to Sam and Anthony for making this happen. My question, Shail, relates to the fact that in the data you showed earlier, only 4% of the total complaints that come to AFCA effectively relate to financial advice. To what extent do you think that either supports or undermines the recommendations to government that we need a compensation scheme of last resort that applies to the delivery of financial advice that's paid for by advisors?
Yeah, look, I mean, this is a sort of a loaded political question. Look, what I can say is I won't comment on who it should be paid for by, but what I would comment on is I've seen lots of tragic cases where you know, firm, in fact, the next one I do, the firm went insolvent and the guy couldn't recover the money. The PI hid, and it's ruined his life. So, you know, I'm in favour of some sort of compensation scheme of last resort. Who it's paid for, I'd make no comment on that. I think that's a trickier one, and you know, AFCA has no position on that.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. So let's keep going. So, and thank you for those comments, everyone. That makes me feel like I'm actually in the real world rather than in some strange fantasy world, which is what it's like when you're working from home sometimes. So, ASIC Guidance Media Release 14191, you may have seen it, essentially where the financial service relates to a super product. The trustee of the SMSF will be classified as retail unless the fund holds net assets of at least 10 million. And as you'd know from the limited licenses for accountants and things, if you're giving advice to someone to set up an SMSF, then that would fall within that you know, that point. So less than 10 million retail. If, however, the financial service does not relate to a super product, so this is where the distinction between, I think, advising a self-managed super fund, what they go into, then it's the general test to apply. And I have to admit, I think ASIC could be clearer on some of this, and we actually are having discussions with them about this. But I just wanted to point out what the sort of current approach is out there and explain how we navigate our way through it. So then ASIC, you know, obviously ASIC went out and said that where the trustee of an existing super fund receives advice about how to invest the assets, ASIC will not take action if the person providing the advice determines whether the trustee is a wholesale client. Now, it's a real technicality, but it does say they will not take action. Doesn't mean they're agreeing with that position. So that's something that I just wanted to touch on, that information out there, and then explain sort of hopefully what you see as a common sense point of view to this. which is that essentially, forgetting the technicalities, right, what we found was, he said he didn't understand it. Now, what we found was here, forgetting all those tests, the complainant didn't read it, as he was informed and reasonably believed that document to be a standard form everyone uses, which was very much dependent on the evidence and what was told to him when the form was sent. The advisor didn't explain the consequences of the complainant signing the form. The complainant was unaware of those consequences and he wasn't given adequate time to consider it. Now, he was about a 77-year-old guy, this guy, and he was actually living overseas. So the advisor emailed it to him and said, sign this, right? And we got a statement from the advisor, and the advisor in that statement made no, despite being asked, he sort of confirmed he had not explained what it was about. So really, in our view, you know, this person did not know what they were signing up to. And that was essentially the problem here. Now, in his loss, just out of interest, he claimed only his losing trades, right? And that made 1.7 million of losses. But of course, he had gains on the other trades. So we don't like the idea of cherry picking. I mean, we don't want to unjustly enrich complainants. So what we said was, look, it's fair in all the circumstances to measure the loss by comparing the actual performance of the portfolio with a suitable portfolio from a certain period. And essentially, we said for this guy, a suitable portfolio was the ASX 200. And that's often what we do. I mean, we'll ask you for submissions on that, but because he wasn't properly classified, the clearest way to understand his sort of but-for position was to put him in the ASX 200. He ended up with about 130,000 for that one. Now, I'm conscious of the time, so I'm going to bolt through. There's a number of scenarios here, so maybe I'll just bolt through them and just see, you know, we'll still have time for questions at the end. But the next one is the one I was talking about, where the company's gone insolvent. Essentially, obviously, people must act in the best interest of the client. And that includes identifying the subject matter, identifying the objectives, identifying the financial situation and needs. Now, in this one, the guy was 29, fly in, fly out work. He had 120,000 in super. He had net equity of 125,000 in his home. And he was earning 200,000 a year at 29, you know. So he's doing pretty well, really. He was single, no dependents. He went and saw the advisor, who happened to be an accountant as well. Now, that's not a crime in itself. But to get his tax done. He also had mental health issues. So what happens is the guy does his tax, but then says, look, we've got some ideas. Now, this is agribusiness, but, you know, take out agribusiness and think of something else tax effective, and the same thing could happen today. But the advisor, you know, come and see me. I can give you some strategies to minimise your tax. So the advisor recommends agribusiness with borrowed funds, and he recommends refinancing of his loan, increasing his equity, and he used the tax returns to invest in investment property. 6 months later, he recommends that he start from SMSF and invest in investment property with a limited recourse loan, November 13. So what happened is and that's a decision if you want to look it up, 545958. So the guy lost his job, fly in, fly out work, and not surprising, had to sell the investment property. And then unfortunately, because he had debts, he then had to he had to sell down his actual house that he owned beforehand. He couldn't find work in Queensland after it, so he had to move to Victoria, and he starts renting there. He then withdraws funds from his SMSF illegally to pay down his tax investment to get out of it. And I've met this guy, you know, Ben, I've spoken to him. Ben's actually the sort of guy you'd like. He's honest, he's down to earth, he's genuine. But he's withdrawn funds from the SMSF to get rid of the tax investment that is stressing him out, the debt, because I think the investment in this one had gone south and he had a loan left. He then had to sell the SMSF property, and sure enough, his mental health condition has got much worse. So suffice, this is what I took the FPA, and they said, look, if we saw this advisor, we'd like to have a word to him about this. But clearly inappropriate advice. this guy didn't actually need to do anything really to achieve his goals. He could have just kept contributing, maybe built a surplus, maybe build up a bit of money, and then invested. He didn't need to gear. It was excessively risky. He had 200,000, so he could have just put a lot of that away. His expenses were very low. He got back all his actual losses outside of super, and inside super, as I was talking about before, the but-for test applied, and he was put back in the industry funds he was in. For the grace of God, luckily, he did retain some of his insurance in his previous fund, because the mental health condition had developed to the point where he could no longer get insurance afterwards. If that had happened and he lost his insurance, the compensation would have been higher. We would have had to get an actuary in. And for a 29-year-old, you can guess what the cost of that loss of insurance would be. Massive. Now, he didn't get back the penalties he incurred from accessing his super funds early, because we basically found that it was too far removed from the original breach. So he didn't get those, unfortunately, but he got a pretty big payout overall. Now, should we keep bolting through here, Anthony, Sam? We've got 3 FASEA scenarios. What would you like to do? Comments there, or?
Yeah, I think I'll keep moving through, but it would certainly be great to go through, the code of ethics, which I think you're going to touch on soon, and how that now applies in the framework that we should use to assess that code of ethics when running our businesses.
Sure.
Would be terrific. And sort of obviously the conflicts, I know you touched on it at the start of this presentation. One of the things that you mentioned was joint ventures between accounting firms and financial planning firms, and the perceived or real conflicts of interest of the nature of the referrals to that JV, given there's kind of joint remuneration between the two parties. So yeah, really like to hear your views on that one as well.
Okay, good.
Well,
yeah.
I've got a couple of questions too. Rob Pine's got another one. Rob, I'll have to silence you soon, but I'll give you a chance to fire away, and then after Rob, Stuart Chandler has asked to see some FASEA examples, so that might just be a request. But Rob, do you want to fire away with your quick question?
Yeah, sure. Shail, so can you please just comment on the legal requirement for advisors when providing advice to document alternatives considered, particularly when we're talking about alternative products, when you're recommending a superannuation fund? We currently document that in the advice document, but we've always been led to believe, as long as it's documented somewhere, and Stuart may even have a remark on this as well, document it, you can put it in the working papers, so you've got a reference there. But documenting alternative products, when you're recommending a product, how many in the super space or insurance space should you also be looking at to prove that you also considered some alternatives when you're actually giving advice?
Yeah, Stuart, did you want to comment at all before I do?
I'll need to allow Stuart in. There you go, Stuart. Stuart?
Not there. Okay, that's all right.
I've given him permission to talk, but what does Shail see coming through on the financial advisor complaints when he shakes his head and says, why are these still happening?
Yeah, okay. So so look, on both, in terms of individual compliance sort of requirements, I mean, I obviously give you the rider that is for your compliance people. I'm not going to tell you how many examples or give that level of precision. I think from my perspective, what it comes down to is, A, that you've actually adequately considered alternative strategies. And I mean adequately, so you have to look at what they were in beforehand. It's hard to talk about it in abstract, but just consider realistic alternatives. And I suppose to give more, I mean, it takes, to give more detail to that, you need to look at the individual circumstances. But essentially what I look towards is to see that you have considered alternatives. So for example, if you're going to recommend someone into an SMSF, as you say, consider what they were in, consider just a retail managed fund as an alternative, give those sort of examples. I won't give you a number of how many to consider. Where you document it, look, my view on all these things is it's always better to put them in the SOA. I mean, the SOA is the key advice document. whilst technically it might be true, you can do it in working notes. My preference is to see it in the SOA. And essentially it just becomes a factor in determining whether we think someone's acted in the best interest of a particular client.
Sure. Okay.
No worries. And I'm happy to talk more about it offline, but obviously I just got to be careful about going into the compliance side and being too sort of that sort of side of things, which is probably your compliance guys area. But on the other one, I mean, I nod my head. All the property referral arrangements just still remain unbelievable. I think the CFD and FX stuff is also really problematic about assessing suitability. But in the financial planning space, I think those are the ones that I just cannot believe is still happening. And as I said, I mean, I sit with FASEA and I do some work with them on the exam, and you look at the questions that are being put, and it's quite unbelievable that these things would still happen. So that'll be the big one there. So if we go into FASEA scenarios, so we're not here to enforce the code. It's really important that everyone understands that. And as ASIC has said, Danielle Press, I think, has said that they're going to take a softly sort of approach to it. They're going to consult at the moment. However, the reality is it does apply if a dispute's lodged about conduct from 1 January 2020. And it could mean a non-fin loss award, could mean breach of best interest, honestly, efficiently, fairly. Some scenarios, I'm just pushing the button. I mean, that's what they are. You all probably know, comply with the law. I think the important ones I'd point out are comply with the law and act with the intent of the law is a really important one. Act with integrity, avoid conflicts. It's a value-based system, and FASEA is very keen to explain this. It's not, what that means is that you've got to act in the spirit of it, really. Don't get, I mean, I know the questions on the exam are largely on technicalities around some of the what applies to what, but it is value-based. So you be conscious of those values. Honesty, fairness are a couple. We'll take a measured and considered approach, taking into account the intentions and objectives of the code, the current environment that the code operates in, FASEA's guidance, ASIC's expectations. So we've got 3 scenarios. It's probably the third one you'll be most interested in, but the first one's a vertical integration one. John about to retire, has an SMSF with $1 million in it. He has 75% of his funds invested in term deposits, 25% in blue chips. This is based on a real example, by the way. He sees Mike, who recommends a diversified portfolio, 25% in Australian equities, 50% in fixed interest, and 25% in a US property fund. He has agreed to a 50% defensive, 50% growth asset allocation. All 4 funds are run by a related entity. Actually, this probably does tie in a bit to the JV one. All 4 funds are run by a related entity, and the fund receives a 1.5% fee based on the investments. So 15 grand per year. John, the advisor, says he does not receive any money from the funds. So is this a breach? I normally open that one up for discussion. Any quick comments on that one? We'll just keep going. So here are the standards. You must act in accordance with the laws, including this code, and not try to avoid or circumvent their intent. You must act with integrity. Standard 3, most importantly, you must not advise, refer, or act in any other manner where you have a conflict of interest. Get informed consent. Just a repeat of things that you probably know. Now, I'll just keep going on the basis that we don't have a lot of time left. So, is there a conflict of interest? Well, there is potentially, because there's an interest in getting a client in to increase the revenue of the US company. Is vertical integration banned? Well, no, it's not banned, and ASIC has highlighted its report some of the benefits of vertical integration, including reduced administration fees. Is Mike allowed to recommend funds of a related entity? You're really lucky, guys, because I'm just going to get to the bottom line because we don't have time. The answer for mine, and it is just one opinion, is that he is allowed to do it, right? So it's not that he's not allowed to do it. There is a huge potential for a conflict of interest here, but it's not an actual conflict. If, and this is the big if, the advice is in the best interest of the particular person. Now, here it's 25% of the portfolio in a US fund. Now, there are arguments whether that's a failure to diversify adequately within the property area, but there might be reasons why that particular fund is suitable. So the simple answer to this is that it's not technically on its own. That is not the slam dunk. The issue is how the advisor has justified the recommendations and have they done adequately. And I think the real problem here is 25% in one particular fund.
But Shail, just to that point Rob raised before, there's going to have to be a lot of explanation around alternatives and why this particular strategy is appropriate for the client as opposed to the alternatives, because lo and behold, the client, that advisor has a vested interest for that client to invest in those products because they're produced by his employer. So how do you justify the alternative space there?
Well, I think Robin, you were right. There would need to be a really thorough explanation that you've considered the alternatives in the property space for that particular fund. I mean, you know, if you're justifying it on the basis that you think US residential property is preferable to other, say, commercial property or managed property funds, diversified managed property funds or whatever else, I would want to see a really good explanation of why that's the case.
But also, just to that point, I'm sure if you reviewed the statements of advice for all the other advisors within that business, it'd be an amazing coincidence that they're all recommending a similar type of product, maybe with a different split, and they've all discounted the alternative. So how can you have a range of clients coming in all being given the same thing? It's just an amazing coincidence that that firm just happens to have the product.
Yes, it is. It is. We try to deal with each dispute on its merits on its own, and we tried to get the advisor to explain it for that particular client. But yeah, we can't help ignore that. If we got 6 complaints similar to that, all in the same fund, then, you know, that is something they would need to explain. Look, I think it's really hard to, the bottom line, I think it's really hard to justify that recommendation. But the point I'm making to you is it's possible to.
Yep.
And to Rob's point previously, which was a good one, I would want to see a really detailed explanation as to what the alternatives were that were considered there and why they were discounted. I mean, other alternatives there, it doesn't have to be property. They could have been in other diversified growth options as well. Yeah. What was it particularly that made you pick property? And if it's based on historical property returns, well, that's not a very good reason on its own, I would have thought. So that's one. What we might do, do you want me to skip this one, Sam, and do the last one? Or this is the one
last one relating to conflicts, so around their accounting relationship. I'll speak through this. I think as sort of the questions are coming through, we've still got 15 minutes or 13 minutes, so feel free to keep going through the slides and we'll jump in as required.
Okay, so the second one is Mary works for Company A, which has an AFCA. They specialise purely in risk. And yeah, you could take that risk and put anything in there, stockbroking, whatever else. I actually only know of one AFCA that does pure risk, Bombora, but there may be others. In any event, the license is to provide holistic advice. She's worked at Company A giving risk advice for 10 years. She's very good at it, and that's her area. Michael's really suspicious of advisors and has come to see Mary because he's concerned about protecting his young family. He's heard Mary's really knowledgeable about insurance. Mary does a comprehensive fact find and makes recommendations on insurance. She happens to notice that he's much more aggressively invested than she thinks is suitable for his circumstances, and she's got concerns about the economic outlook. However, because she doesn't specialise, she does not mention this to Michael and limits her advice to insurance, which are fantastic. Michael accepts these and happily moves on. Is it a breach? The short answer was most advisors at the SMSF conference thought it was. in the same way as if a doctor finds a cancerous mole while investigating you for a flu, they would raise it with you in the same way. I suppose the confusing part some people find with this is that you need to be competent in the area that you're giving advice in. And on one view, she might not be. But the bottom line is that she doesn't, just because she's identified it, she doesn't then need to give advice on it. She can refer him on to someone else. So it's sort of, you know, to me, you're complying with the code by identifying it and telling him. You're probably breaching the code if you go the next step and give him advice on it, if you see what I mean. Because you're qualified to understand the problem, but you're probably not qualified to take the next step. So that's the simple answer there. And, you know, I put comments about scoping. Obviously, these days, you can't really scope out things if they're inherently required to be advised on. You have lots of debates about that too. Now, the next one is probably one you might have seen. It's example 7 of the FASEA code guidance. Regina, Rex and Regina is, we do comment to Stephen about these names that they pick for various examples. They distract from the main point. But Regina's in her late 50s seeking retail financial advice. Cedric is director and principal of a small advice business. So he's also a principal of an associated accounting business. Cedric does not receive any fees or benefits he refers to the accounting firm. His remuneration is strictly limited to his shares in profits in the associated firm. So he advises Regina. So he's getting profits out of the financial planning company, but he's also an advisor there, and he's also principal of an associated accounting business. So he advises her to start an SMSF, roll over existing 1.2 million into the SMSF in a diversified portfolio. He covers the advantages and disadvantages of all the other strategies. So he goes through every other alternative in the SOA and does it properly. He also offers to provide ongoing accounting services. And it's on a fee for service basis rather than on volume invested. Be interested if people think that's a breach of the code of ethics. So he's clearly getting advantages here. I mean, he rolls her in, gets her as a client, he gets profits out of that. He sends her off to the accounting firm. I mean, you know, what's the difference between this and that property referral business I told you about, where you've got the accountant, all under the same group? You've got the accountant. Yeah, Rob's interested in the answer. I agree. I think it's a really interesting issue, Rob. What's the difference between this and the property referral business, where you've got the accountant, you've got the mortgage broker, you've got the advisor, all on the same floor, and the client sees all three of them at once. Definitely different interests there.
I mean, there's standard 3 says that you can't refer where there's a potential conflict of interest. So surely there is a conflict there. He's referring it to parties within his own organisation or separate sort of JVs, but he's being remunerated or will receive some sort of remuneration, whether it's via a distribution of profits. I'd say it's highly conflicted.
Okay, that's good. Because, and this is why I wanted to bring up this example, and this is not according to me, this is according to FASEA. So standards are, you must not advise, refer or act in any other manner where you have a conflict of interest or duty. All advice and financial products that you give to a client must be in the best interest of the client, standard 5, and you must satisfy yourself that any fees are fair and reasonable, standard 7. Now this is according to FASEA, not me, and remember that this is subject to further consultation and discussion. But you don't breach standard 3 merely by receiving a share of profit from an enterprise that lawfully provides retail advice. So the fact he's a director and he's receiving a profit from that advice, that's not a breach on its own. You will breach standard 3 where the dominant purpose of providing advice to clients is to derive profits from selling those clients ancillary products or services from which you personally benefit. Now, arguably, this is, I think, your point, Sam, those ancillary, if you call the accounting services ancillary, he's getting a personal benefit off those. So surely this is a breach. According to FASEA, the advice complies with standard 5 because, so the, don't know how to go backwards, because by investigating Regina's super and her needs, he has a basis to establish it's in her best interests. So it complies with standard 5. The conflict of interest point will arise if, and so it's not, so remember this is conditional, if Cedric refers Regina to his accounting business to establish the SMSF and to provide ongoing services, as Cedric will derive a financial benefit, which is your point, Sam, unless, and this is what I find interesting, unless Cedric can clearly establish that the advice is in Regina's best interests and is in compliance with all code provisions, FASEA's words, including establishing the charge fees are reasonable and represent value for money. So what I read that as saying is that whilst there's a huge potential for conflict here, if that advice to enter the SMSF is in her best interest and he's done a thorough analysis, and secondly, that the accounting services offered are fair and reasonable, he's not going to be breaching the code of ethics.
It's an interesting one. Well, we see it so often, so it'd be, yeah, time will tell with that one.
Yeah, so it is a really interesting one, and I think some of the messaging from FASEA, they get quite frustrated about this in a way, about the criticisms about conflict, because this is what they actually mean. And it doesn't come across necessarily in some of the material.
I'm just conscious we've got sort of 5 minutes left. Is there any questions there before we move on, say, to the final slide or slides and wrap it up? Is there anything coming through from your end there, Anne?
No.
No, terrific.
If anyone just raise your hand or type question in the chat, just the word, I'll turn your ability to talk on.
Right. We might move on to the to these tips, and I think if you could maybe just expand a little bit on the detailed file notes, because I think the other things, the other points you raise in there should be well known, but just file notes is a really key one. One that we drum home to our staff, who probably do a better job than Nat and I, if I'm honest, in terms of taking detailed file notes, but a really important one.
So yeah, no worries, Sam. I mean, there's a lot in that material that's gone before. I'm sorry. Can you hear that?
Yeah.
Short answer was that, what have I done? Wherever the slides were. Yeah. So the file notes, detailed file notes. So what I comment about that is that, you know, I worked as an advisor. I know how hard it is. I worked during the GFC, numerous calls, numerous things going on. I'd like to see plain English file notes. I'd like to see file notes sort of explaining what happened in a sort of a narrative almost. You know, client came in and saw me. They were really upset. They wanted to discuss as accurately as possible, not what's the word? Just made up sort of file notes as to what you think you want us to hear. We can tell the difference. Disputes turn on file notes. Whilst the SOA is the key record, if there's any ambiguity, we go back to them. I've had a dispute turn on a diagram of an SMSF, a transitional retirement strategy. But what I like to see is that you just, you indicate what was the client concerned about? What was I responding to? How is their demeanour? What was the outcome of the meeting? Common sense sort of stuff. And you're even better off, even if you don't have a chance, because I'm not a great file noter while I talk, I tend to do it afterwards. Even if you do a really quick one afterwards, that's not perfect, that contemporaneous note can be more valuable than one done a month later. That's the other thing I'd really like to put out there.
Looks like we might have a question there from Peter Mansell.
Hi again, Shail. This one's a question that probably I should have asked right back at the outset. At the most basic level within AFCA's charter, is it the starting position of AFCA for all disputes where there's the presumption of innocence on the part of the accused?
Yeah, look, you know, I mean, you're sort of using, you know, words that apply to criminal trials in some ways, Peter, and I really want to make it clear that our role is dispute resolution, and the standard is the balance of probabilities. And absolutely, I mean, you know, I don't assume just because it's come into us that the advisor's guilty at all. And in fact, I don't view it that it's actually even a problem that you've been, someone's complained to AFCA about you. I think you really only know what the advisor's done right or wrong when you make a final decision. And even then it might not be clear cut, but absolutely, Peter, we don't just accept what the complainant says straight away. We need to do a really big investigation to work it out. And many good advisors have complaints against them at AFCA.
Bianca, you had a question earlier. If you're still there.
We might continue for an extra 5 minutes if everyone's comfortable with that, which will take us to about 11:35 if that's okay with everyone. But if anyone needs to drop off, thank you very much for your attendance, and we'll just continue for another 5 if that's okay.
Sorry, Shail, can you hear me there?
Yeah, I've got you, Bianca, thanks.
Perfect. I was just about to ask, the breaches that you're seeing, is it advisors that genuinely think they're doing the right thing by their client, or is it them actually more thinking that they're just not going to get caught?
I think some of them don't think about it at all. Some of them are just really thinking about the profit imperative. There are some, and I'm thinking of a particular CEO of a particular group that does some of this stuff, who actually believe what they're doing is right. So I do think there's a bit of a delusion sometimes, and that's part of what we have to do, is sometimes see through some of those things. You know, they sort of say, well, the person was interested in property, we were just facilitating it, you know, and property makes a lot of money. You know, it's a sort of a very simplistic analysis, but, you know, simple answer is, I think some don't think about it at all, have no awareness. Some legitimately believe that they're doing the right things. They're sort of a bit blinded, and some don't care. But your reaction is very similar to what a lot of, you know, good advisors would say.
Fantastic. We might get you, if you can, maybe, Shail, just to sort of summarise in the last couple of minutes, and just if anyone else has any questions, now's the time. And are you happy for these slides to be sent out to today's participants or today's audience?
Yeah, no, not a problem. Yeah, look, I just say I've enjoyed talking to you today. I mean, I would have, you know, it's good to get the interaction. So I continually like to hear from advisors out there in the real world, what they're seeing, what they're doing. You know, so I just invite you to stay in contact and keep the contact going. I'd much prefer to see you in this sort of environment rather than at a dispute.
Well, just to that point, Shail, I know we've got your contact details at the end of this presentation. Are you happy for you know, members of the audience to make direct contact with you if they've got specific questions, or to, you know, facilitate these types of Q&A sessions with their businesses?
Yeah, not a problem at all. More than happy, as long as it's a dual street where I can get some feel from you as to what you're seeing out there as well. I'd appreciate that too. Yeah, not a problem at all.
Great, thank you.
So we won't do that, but yeah, so in summary, look, we do apply a common sense approach to it. We understand the regulatory burden at the moment. I think the bottom line for me is the integrity point. Try to do the right thing by your client, try to do the best you can, and you'll generally be okay.
Fantastic. Well, we might leave it there unless there's any other questions, but thank you so much for your time today, Shail. We really appreciate you taking the time to explain the common sense approach. I think that AFCA is really demonstrating that. It's terrific to hear from a regulator or a regulatory body that there is a common sense approach. We kind of view that these disputes get, you know, occasionally found against us or found against the industry, but really it's those people that are doing the wrong thing, are getting caught out. It's not the people that are trying to have the right intent for their clients by what you've demonstrated there. And such a small percentage of the complaints leveled are really against financial advisors, and it seems to be, you know, the product providers or other issues, stockbrokers, etc., that are getting caught out. So thank you so much. We really do appreciate it. And I'm sure there'll be a number of people from the audience that may make contact with you in due course. Actually, if you just want to go to that last slide, Shail, it's got all your contact details there that people can make contact. But thank you all for your attendance today, guys. Stay safe, stay well, and we look forward to hosting another one of these with you down the track. We'll send out the recording and the PDF of the slides for you today or tomorrow.
And it's Singh@afca.org.au, and you'll be able to get me directly.
Yeah. So is that seeing it? Okay, yeah, great.
Yep.
We might add that onto the end.
Too easy.
Terrific. Thank you.
Thanks for that.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone.